I'm Peter Nelson. I'm the chair of the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues and an assistant professor in environmental science policy and management, as well as in Native studies within the Ethnic Studies Department here at Berkeley. I'd like to ask anyone in the audience to turn off their cell phones. And also to start by acknowledging that UC Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun people, the ancestral and unceded land of the Chochenyo Ohlone people. So this land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with university values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and our commitment to hold the university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So it's my pleasure to welcome you today to today's event, which is sponsored by the Joseph A. Myers Center for Research on Native American Issues and the Native American Studies Department, or Native American Student Development, sorry. And I wanted to thank also Deborah Lustig for helping me prepare comments for this introduction as well. You know, looking at our upcoming events too, just to key you into some other great things that will be happening here on campus. We have a talk and basket weaving demo by Lucy and Julia Parker, and that's going to be on October 18th at 3:30. So information about that event is on our website. And for those of you on Zoom, you should see the info in the chat. Okay, so for the format of today's event, we'll have Professor Whitley speak for about 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. And for those of you joining via Zoom, please use the Q&A feature to write in your questions, and I will ask those on your behalf. So I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. I'm delighted that we have Kathleen Whitley, an assistant professor of Native American Studies at UC Davis. After receiving her PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, she was a UC President's postdoctoral fellow here at UC Berkeley. So it's a pleasure to have her back on campus again. Professor Whitley's research focuses on Native American history in California from the 19th century to the present, with particular emphasis on the social, legal, and gender dimensions of Indigenous North America. Her current book manuscript, Justice in the Balance, The Indians of California versus the United States of America, 1900 through 1955, is the first work to trace the history of the land claims cases brought by the Native peoples of California against the US federal government. Her talk today, which is History on the Lost Coast, Locating Wiyot Stories of the American the resilience stories, sorry, I'll start over again. History of the Lost Coast, Locating Wiyot Stories of Resilience in Nancy and Matilda Spear, is based on a forthcoming article in the American Historical Review. Please join me in welcoming Professor Whitley.
Thank you so much, Peter. Well, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for Peter for the introduction. My name is Kat Whitley. I'm here to present my article today. First, I wanted to introduce myself a little bit and some of my other work. This is me. This is at Table Bluff. I'm an assistant professor at UC Davis in the Department of Native American Studies. I do Native American history. I'm a UC Berkeley alum, so I'm really happy to be back here. And I'm from Eureka, California, and I'm a descendant of the Wiyot tribe. I got interested in doing work in Native studies through my grandfather, who's named Dwayne McLean, who is an enrolled member of the Wiyot tribe in Eureka. Eureka, locate us. We are all the way up on the coast near the star up there in Humboldt County. This article is an outgrowth of a short film project called Tulot Reclaimed. This film is directed by Michelle Hernandez, who is a Wiyot tribal citizen. And this short film features 5 interviews with Wiyot tribal leaders and community members to trace the intergenerational political activism and environmental cleanup to reclaim the village of Tulot, the Wiyot Center of the World. It is sponsored by a University of California grant. The film's website will be up within hopefully the next 2 weeks. We have some exciting news. It was awarded Best Local Film at the Humboldt International Film Festival. The website will have the film itself, which is about 15 minutes, which I hope you'll share. And it's great little bite-sized media for our classes, and as well as some newspaper articles and primary sources that can be used alongside of the short film. We also did a film screening in Humboldt at Cal Poly Humboldt in December. The screening will be up on the website also, with featured a Q&A with some of the stars of the film, Ted Hernandez and Dr. Cutcher-Liston Baldy. My book manuscript is called Justice in the Balance, The Indians of California versus the United States of America. I'll talk about the land claims cases a little bit later in my presentation, but my book manuscript is going to trace both of these cases when all the Indians of California are going to come together to sue the federal government for the value of lands that is currently in California, which worked out to about 47 cents per acre in 1972. So if anyone during that time remembers getting a check in the mail from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for 688 bucks, this is from this case. I became interested in this case because my mom was part of it, and my grandpa, as well as 70,000 other Indians of California that were part of the land claims cases. Today I'm here to present my article that'll be forthcoming out in December. It's called History on the Lost Coast, Locating Wiyot Stories of Resilience in Nancy and Matilda's Fear. In 2019, the Wiyot tribe captured international headlines when over 200 acres of the island of Tulot on the north coast of California was returned to the tribe by the city of Eureka. The island, which is the most sacred place in the world for Wiyot peoples, had been the site of an infamous massacre in 1860 during the tribe's world renewal ceremony. In the aftermath, the land had been stolen by white settlers, and it was not until 2014 that the tribe, under the leadership of Wiyot chairman Ted Hernandez and Cheryl Seidner, once again performed the renewal ceremony. When Eureka became the first city in the United States to return land to a Native nations 5 years later, the event created a blueprint for other tribal nations advocating for land back. With this sacred land return, the Wiyot tribe is now pointed to new kinds of social and cultural politics. This essay is a response to an American Historical Review call that works on resilience, how to revive as it's framed after things fall apart. It would be hard to find a case in which things fall apart more than completely than they have historically done for the Native people in California. While this history is deeper than the American occupation of Native land, the later half of the 19th century evinces a particularly brutal history of violent displacement by white settlers and the political machinery supporting their land claims. The "we are still here" rhetoric that marks so much Native American political discourse is therefore particularly necessary and pressing in California. Such claims cannot help but also mark the ways that we narrate that history. The massacre on Tulot was a point so low one cannot imagine a return, and yet the Wiyot did. They are still here, and their story has much to tell us about resilience and cultural survival. The massacre on Tulot was just one attack by settlers in a week-long coordinated genocide of other villages, and part of a larger campaign of violence that marks California's history. During the early morning hours on February 26, 1860, white settlers took boats and canoes over to Indian Island, as it was known, where members of several of the Wiyot villages had gathered for a week-long world renewal ceremony. While women and children of the Wiyot tribe slept, white perpetrators snuck into their camp armed with axes, swords, knives, and clubs. They circled the small island and murdered upwards of 80 Wiyot people, almost all women and children. Wiyot men were away from the island that morning, as was tradition, because they were hunting in preparation for the ceremony. After leaving the island, the militia continued its path of destruction around Jarajuji, now known as Rika and Wiki, Humboldt Bay. The attack started in Rio Del, attack started with the villages at Slide on the south shore of the Eel River, continued to Rio Del, Ferndale, Centerville, Indianola, Table Bluff, and Salmon Creek. By the time the violence had ended, the killers had murdered upwards of 285 Wiyot people. Humboldt County's presence and history of the mass slaughter of California Indians was not limited to a single massacre, group of vigilantes, or a government-sanctioned militia. Yet the militia's business in February 1860 was killing American Indians. As historian Benjamin Madley has shown, the militia's violence was an officially sanctioned genocide of California Indians under United States rule. The violence, he argues, was widespread enough to point to state and federal governments as a, quote, killing machine. Violence was perpetrated by groups of vigilantes, as in Humboldt County, but often the perpetrators were soldiers in the US Army or members of the California State Militia. In all, Madley estimates a minimum of some 9,000 to 16,000 California Indians, and probably many more, were killed by US Army troops. These atrocities were committed with the intent to exterminate and were funded by the state of California. The story of Native people in California is a challenging and painful one, as we've come to understand through the works of Benjamin Madley, Michael Bagliari, Jeannie Pfizer, and so many others. Previous scholarship on the Humboldt Bay massacres at Tuluwat, South Beach, and Eel River has illustrated the ways in which Wiyots experienced settler colonial forces such as genocide, displacement, captivity, and forced assimilation, all part of what historic Patrick Wolf referred to as the logic of elimination. And yet, the Wiyot did survive, and in doing so, they carved out a history of resilience and cultural survival that remains to be told in full. By foregrounding genocide, violence, and data sets, existing accounts often leave little room for understanding the humanity, resilience, and intergenerational affirmations of futurity in Native California. Pushing for future genocide scholarship that moves beyond the mindset of the perpetrators to analyze the worldview of the victims themselves, as well as the centrality of Native actions and beliefs, is paramount for correcting the legacy of white dominant perspectives in the historical record. Efforts to illuminate Native voices are seen through the works of Cutcher-Risling Baldwin, William Bauer, Amy Lone-Tree, Josh Reed, Margaret Jacobs, Carl Jacoby, Ned Blackhawk, Jeff Osler, and so many others. Similarly, the purpose of professional organizations like the California Indian Studies and Scholars Association is to support and increase the exchange of California Indian perspectives, ways of knowing, and the diversity of knowledge. Centering the perspectives of genocide survivors and their descendants shows that Wiyot peoples encountered and engendered change and conflict through healing, survivance, and presence. The 1860 massacre at Tuluwat was catastrophic for Wiyot peoples, but its true impact can only be measured in the lives of survivors, who were forever changed, and the communities they reconstituted in the wake of tragedy. Nancy and Matilda Spear were young women and first cousins who survived the massacre. Nancy and Matilda stayed together over the course of their lifetimes, raising 15 mixed-race children who lived to adulthood. The area of Freshwater Slough became the landmark in stories of survival for Wiyot peoples. By positioning these women and their descendants at the center of the analysis, this article sheds new light on how the Wiyot peoples of coastal California survived and revived their community in the face of genocidal policies aimed at destroying their families, communities, and way of life. The experience of Wiyot peoples in the years before and after 1860 illustrates the ongoing practice of plunder perpetuated against Native peoples. Plunder is a form of what one might call post-genocide oppressions, including indenture, enslavement, continued dispossession, and other ways Native peoples' lives and communities were plundered for settler gain. Drawing on Michael Wickens' Seeing Red, Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder, a kind of centerpiece to this history was the near erasure of 18 lost treaties that were negotiated between 1851 and 1852 in California. They were buried by Congress until the earliest 20th century. And the loss of these treaties enabled the government to seize land and remove Native communities without oversight. But through it all, the Wiyot maintained social relationships, cultural practices, and political identities over time and generations by adapting to changing circumstances and reasserting tribal identities at critical turning points. Examples can be found in the creation of early 20th century rancheria land bases, the Pan-Indian organizing around the lost treaties, the creation of the unique Indians of California identity, and the contemporary politics of Tuluwat and the city of Eureka. Where white plunder has been a defining feature of this history since 1860, this is not the end of the story. The stories of resilience told by Nancy and Matilda's fellow survivors and descendants in particular, showcase the importance of Native women and how the community processed the horrors of mass violence and attempted to heal the wounds left by genocide. Notably, the voices of Nancy and Matilda are largely absent from the standard historical record. This article incorporates sources produced by or reflects the perspectives of Wiyot people in order to illuminate their story and the greater narrative of Wiyot survivance in oral histories, in Indian agent reports, newspapers, and photographs. Central to the efforts to remember or revive are the Wiyot History Papers, a remarkable set of documents translated and transcribed in the 1920s by Warren Brainard, a young Wiyot student who attended the Chemawa Indian boarding school. These documents contain the only known statements that are both given by and recorded by Wiyots about the massacre on Tuluwa. In addition, Olive Davis, Nancy Spears' granddaughter, compiled a 200-page handwritten family history in the 1920s, preserving important stories of the past as possible resources for the future. Furthermore, and following historian Maurice Crandall's invitation to scholars to utilize Indigenous methodologies originating from Indigenous communities to better understand how they experience colonialism, genocide, and modernity, this article applies analytical methods and protocols to survivor stories to highlight Wiyot ways of thinking, being, and becoming. These tribal archives immerse us in a space of recognizing and appreciating the ways that Wiyot peoples understood their identity and tangible community. They also point to the ways of community identity persisted despite genocidal attempts to erase Wiyot people. This persistence mattered not just on a human level, but also on a cultural level. By viewing this history of survival through the lens of Wiyot peoples, both the terminology and the stakes of the discussion shift, reflecting how Wiyots understood the politics, patterns, and unrelenting violence being perpetuated against them. Nancy and Matilda's choices and experience are flattened, if only seen through settler colonial forces of violence, trauma, and assimilation. By reframing their story as one of resilience and survivance in Native American history, we see culturally specific practices of resilience. Through source-based and concept work, this article respects the mission of Native American Indigenous Studies to work with, by, and for Native peoples. This labor is a pressing issue, as recent methodological debates within and outside the field of Native American Indigenous Studies suggest. Most visibly, Alyssa Mount Pleasant, Caroline Wigington, and Kelly Weisskopf frame the stakes of this methodological turn in their 2018 essay, Materials and Methods in Native American Indigenous Studies, Completing the Turn. Unfortunately and unpleasantly, a book review that appeared shortly thereafter within the pages of this journal, American Historical Review, indicated the resistance that remains toward utilizing NICE methodologies, while the subsequent roundtable discussion of the review, led by Phil Deloria, Jean O'Brien, and others, showcased their rich potential. As these roundtable contributors indicated, new and unplumbed sources yet to be discovered in the context less traditionally archival and more in the vein of the tribal archive are poised to complement and revise strong interpretive readings of evidence for what might be thought of as traditional historical methods. This argument indeed follows a long tradition of asserting there are tribal ways of reading even the standard archives. Following this methodological mission and pathway, this article seeks to amplify untold stories from American Indian history and move California Indians from the margin to the center by foregrounding Native voices and ways of knowing. This work thus moved beyond the history of American genocide by exploring the role of Native peoples as complicated agents struggling for their own future. By 1860, the Wiyot way of life had drastically changed in relation to mounting white settlement, violence, disease, and the environmental destruction of the giant and ancient coast redwoods. In the 1850s, approximately 2,500 white settlers quickly overtook the Wiyot population, which was estimated at anywhere between 1,000 and 3,300 people at the time. In 1860, at the time of the massacre, Nancy and Matilda were young mothers. As first cousins around the same age, they had both been in common law marriages to white settlers and were living in the area renamed the original Wiyot place name to Freshwater. Matilda was in a partnership with Arnold Call Spear, a farmer, and had given birth to 2 children. And Nancy had been briefly linked to a white sea captain and given birth to 2 children. By 1857, she was cohabiting with Albert Hitchcock and had 2 sons, Stephen and Andrew Jackson Hitchcock. When the perpetrators attacked, Nancy and Matilda, like so many Wiyot mothers and their children, were asleep. As the attackers snuck from house to house to murder the inhabitants, a handful of Wiyot people were awoken by the noise and were able to flee ahead of the perpetrators' arrival at their doorstep. This was the case for Nancy and Matilda. who fled and hid with their children on the west side of the island. Afterward, they found 7 other Wiyot children left alive. They put the entire group in a canoe, they rowed them across the bay, and then they walked to Matilda's homestead in freshwater. Wiyot canoes, constructed from ancient redwood trees, were considered to be living relatives, and this reflected a relationship far more complex than simply a form of transportation. Though Nancy and Matilda's perspectives were not recorded at the time, their stories can still be heard in accounts left by others. Thanks to the transcription of Wiyot Warren Brainard, we hear the perspectives of other Wiyot survivors whose stories were similar to Nancy and Matilda's. In the 1920s, Brainard, whose mother had survived a different massacre on that same tragic night, transcribed several accounts by Wiyot elders about the violence of the 1850s and 1860s. Referred to as the Wiyot History Papers, these documents contain the only known statements that were both given by and recorded by Wiyots about the massacre on Tuluwat. The papers record the harrowing stories of individuals who survived the night. For example, Polly Steve was badly wounded during the attack and left for dead. A young man named Mad River Billy witnessed his family murdered and escaped from the island by jumping into the bay and swimming to Eureka, where he alerted anyone, sympathetic settlers or other native peoples, to the unfolding horror. Jerry James, an infant, was discovered in his murdered mother's arms, the only survivor found the next day. A profound testament to community dedication, Jerry James devoted his life to preserving Wiyot ways of life and was the nation's political leader until his death. The voices of 2 women in particular shape the memory of the massacre as preserved by the Wiyot History Papers: Jane Sam and Jane Searson. Like Nancy and Matilda, Jane Sam was asleep in her home on Tuluwat when the white settlers attacked. Unlike Nancy and Matilda, she did not escape the island until much later. Instead, she survived by hiding in the community's trash pile. Sometimes called Jeannie Sands, Jane Sam's testimony represents the only known first-person account recorded by a victim of the massacre. The thoroughness of her account mentions the number of houses in the village and the manner of which the massacre was carried out. Just 13 years old at the time, she witnessed the events from where she was hiding, and she recalled to Brainard that they were sleeping in the 4 big houses and was sound asleep in nearly daylight. White men went in all houses, blocked the doors so Indians could not get out. Some came out and ran to the canoes to get away. They just massacred them as fast as they came out of the houses. Jane Searson, meanwhile, was at the home she shared with her white husband on the mainland while she watched the perpetrators leave in their boats. She was 18 years old at the time of the massacre, and she witnessed the massacre from afar. Like Nancy and Matilda, she was married to a white settler and had 1 mixed-race daughter. Her husband's home was located between 2 of the white settlers, identified as by Jerry Rhodey as those who had participated in the massacre, as well as were labeled in the Wiyot History Papers. Immediately after murdering so many Wiyot women and children, the white settlers then set about pillaging Tuluwat. As Jane Sam recalled, these white men took all things such as beads, baskets, fur, hide, bows, and arrows. All the property belonging to the dead that was not taken was destroyed by burning. At the break of day, I saw 2 boatloads of white men going across to Eureka. These were the men that done the massacring. Now, this was part of the plunder, framed through the perspective of a woman who was just 13, hiding in a trash pile, who was exposed to the craven calculus of settlers whose violence also brought them a financial windfall. Next, it began with burial. The next morning, surviving Wiyots and other Northern California Indians, some indentured white families, buried those who were murdered. In spite of witnessing unspeakable horrors, Jane Sam's account of the immediate aftermath of the massacre illustrates a strong level of care paid to the deceased, even against the backdrop of violence and displacement that was still unfolding across the region. According to Jane Sam, the next day they buried the bodies on the island, as well as took bodies to Mad River for burial. Some were taken to South Bay and some to Freshwater. Sadly, the mourners were given little time to honor the departed. After the massacres, many Wiyots, including Jane Searson, was forcibly taken by the military to Fort Humboldt and then to the Klamath River and Smith River reservations. Ostensibly relocated for their own protection, the removal of surviving Wiyots was haphazard and cruel. In fact, in the Wiyot language, the name for Fort Humboldt is Juwich-Gurum, which means to, quote, draw one's legs up to their body, reflecting the inhumane conditions inflicted on Indigenous peoples who were held there against their will in the early 1860s. In the end, nearly 450 surviving Wiyots were forcibly removed to the Klamath River Reservation, located 50 miles north of Humboldt Bay. Most Wiyot people did not stay. They thought to return home. Meanwhile, many Wiyot submitted voluntarily to indenture in order to remain in their home villages and sought out some sort of protection from white settlers who can now be vested with formal and legally recognized rights to custody and service. Historian Malcolm Magliari, for example, found that in January 1861, 41 Indian servants, at least 29 whom were Wiyots, were indentured to 19 white employers. It was within this dispersed context of trauma, strategic choices, and the long reach of genocide that Wiyot peoples began to process the rebuilding of the community. Yet, if anyone looks for justice in the aftermath of massacres and subsequent relocations, they will be disappointed. No arrests were ever made for the Wiyot genocide in Eureka. Newspaper writer Bret Harte nationally hailed the city of Eureka as Murderville and described the mass murder in unstinting detail. His words offer a heroic departure from other reporting at the time that either ignored or diminished the violence of the attack. Indeed, the perpetrators were protected by prominent members of the community, and moreover, in the wake of the massacre, the island was renamed to Gunther Island after a white settler named Robert Gunther, a man that just purchased the island from another white settler just 3 days before the massacre. In the long aftermath of the massacre, the family dynamics of survivance, community building, and healing illustrates the intimate ways survivors like Nancy and Matilda and their descendants re-exerted their social and cultural meanings and practices. After Nancy's husband died in 1866, she moved in with her cousin Matilda and Arnold Spear, her husband. Nancy had 6 children at this time. The following year, Matilda passed away from disease, and during this time, it appears Nancy worked as a domestic servant in a white household in Table Bluff. Subsequently, Nancy married Arnold Spear, Matilda's husband. In 1871, Arnold formally petitioned for guardianship of 4 of Nancy's children. On this document was Nancy's X mark of consent to the adoption. As Scott Lyons writes, the X mark is a contaminated and coerced sign of consent made under conditions that are not one's making. It signifies power and lack of power, agency and lack of agency. But importantly, it's always possible that an X mark could result in something good. Together, Nancy and Arnold had an additional 8 children. In total, 15 children survived to adulthood in this blended family, the eldest born in 1854 and the youngest in 1879. The choices of this next generation illustrate a meaningful desire to reclaim and celebrate their culture and participate in community together. In 1920, many of the life stories of the children and grandchildren of Nancy and Matilda were compiled into a history written by Olive Dean Davis, born in 1903 and passed away in 1985. Olive's storytelling and passion for history preserved important narratives of the past and document a time rich with presence and resilience. Olive was the daughter of Mary Spear Dean and the youngest daughter of Matilda. Olive grew up on the Spear homestead after her father passed away, and at 18 years old, she self-published a 200-page handwritten family history and genealogy. Her work as a writer and historian inspired her lifelong career path as a librarian for the Humboldt County Library. Olive's history of the descendants of Nancy and Matilda is structured around space and place. The Spear homestead, both a physical location on the land and its space maintained through traditions and social ties that bind family. For Arnold Spear's part, his actions demonstrate a particularly American cultural imprint on the children. He fared well, even as the head of a mixed blood family during a moment of prejudice against Wiyot peoples. This is a photograph or a picture of 4 of Nancy's children back from a successful deer hunt on the Spear homestead. In this environment, the children of Nancy and Matilda found work at early ages in the logging and service industry. Male descendants not only labored, but also commanded and bossed diverse crews filled with other Northern California Indians. For example, Andrew Johnson Spear worked for different logging companies, eventually rising to the head rank of chain tender called the donkey boss. As the head chopper, he first determined which way the redwood was to fall, marking out a path where it would least injure itself or other timber. Importantly, Spear and others did not simply cave to assimilatory labor markets by swapping one form of labor out in the woods, hunting, gathering, or agriculture, for another in logging. Rather, they reshaped their own lives and practices according to external constraints. Unlike the older children, many of Nancy and Matilda's younger children were offered educational opportunities close to home. In the 1870s, Arnold Spear served as a school trustee of Humboldt County, and many Spear children and other mixed-race children attended grammar school in Freshwater, California. William Bill Sykes, Nancy's son, continued as a trustee at Garfield School, which still stands today, in the 1890s, even though he dropped out of school at the age of 11 to work on dairy ranches and in the lumber business. And some of Nancy and Matilda's children and many grandchildren were either forced or in some cases chose to attend Native American boarding schools, which included at Chemawa and at Hupa. There's also stories of Spear descendants like Cromwell Dooley, who went on to play college at Haskell Indian Nations School, which is a prestigious program at the Haskell Indian Institute in Kansas. Excuse me. Eileen Cromwell studied nursing in Phoenix at an Indian school and traveled to different places working in these large hospitals before returning home. But notably, some of Nancy and Matilda's descendants never returned to freshwater after leaving for school. Sadly, Andrew Johnson Spear's son, who's number 1 in this photo, perished at the school on the Hupa Reservation, and 2 of Francis Hitchcock McLean's children, a daughter of Nancy, Stella and Myrtle, died of meningitis while in Hupa. At Indian boarding schools, the death of children from disease, malnutrition, and violence was not uncommon. And at the turn of the 20th century, boarding schools could offer an education and opportunity to Native youth, but one structured by the imperatives of assimilation policy, which rarely delivered meaningful mental and physical care. A story that showcases just how much the broader community continued to connect with Wiyot peoples through the lens of cultural production and entertainment is seen through Nancy's son, Patrick Henry Spear, who found employment in a more creative field. Henry Spear attended the Chemawa Indian School in Oregon, where he studied to become a blacksmith. After his return from Chemawa Indian School, Henry Spear was remembered for his bouts as a welterweight in the boxing ring in Eureka. And starting at the age of 14, he made his own violin and string instruments, crafting folk fiddles out of redwood burls. Notably, it was in his music, however, that Henry Spear truly thrived and where we could see his most prominently the legacy of Wiyot culture in his daily life. Notably, Henry Spear's musical prominence within Humboldt County had significant political context, as he was an active member of a Wiyot political group called the Eureka Auxiliary of the Indians of California. Henry Spear played as part of a headlining Indian band that advertised across California to fundraise for this cause, serving as vice president and secretary with his siblings and cousins and other Wiyot leaders such as Jerry James, Dan Prince, and Ben Scott. In the 1920s, he was also involved with the California Indian Brotherhood, advocating for Wiyot self-determination. As an organizing point in the early 20th century, intertribal political activism emerged from the back and forth surrounding the animation of the unratified 18 treaties in California. In 1923, for example, Henry Spear was the band leader at the Eureka All-Indian celebration held at Sequoia Park. This intertribal gathering was attended by upwards of 1,000 California Native peoples from other local tribes such as Hupa Valley Tribe, Yurok, Crook, Tolowa, and Wailaki, and people from Round Valley. And this is one of the photos, the postcard that was made. Other descendants like Daniel Webster Spear and Ivy Hitchcock Ortenier made a more active and sustained effort to bring Wiyot-centered politics and justice to the foreground of their professional lives. Dan and Ivy organized community events to raise funds for the Indian Board of Cooperation and traveled across the state. Coming out of ways of kin, place, community, and culture, Dan and Ivy found purpose in intertribal organizing efforts on behalf of the Indians of California, watershed land claims case. This case had the potential to pay off California Indians for lost tribal lands. Following the passage of federal legislation on behalf of the Indians of California in 1928, a statewide intertribal group of Native Californians came together to sue the federal government in the Court of Claims for the value of reservation land that would have been set aside under 18 treaties negotiated in 1851 and 1852. Instead, the treaties, representing a staggering 8.5 million acres, had gone unratified and were lost for decades under a congressional injunction of secrecy. When they were rediscovered in 1905, Congress was unwilling to grant outright compensation appropriations for the lands promised in the treaties. Rather, it adopted a system of legislation that authorized Indian bands or tribes to sue the U.S. In the Court of Claims through Native American Special Jurisdictional Acts. Critically, when the original treaties were drafted, the Wiyot were stripped of their land without any voice. They were not mentioned in the treaty because disease had already taken such a toll on Wiyot leaders, so they were too ill to meet with the treaty commissioners. But now, however, with the new legislation, which grouped all Indians of California together, the Wiyots might finally see some financial compensation for the loss of their ancestral homeland. Indeed, a crucial component of the intertribal activism that followed the legislation proved to be the community building that would bring the legal category of California Indian off the page and into the lives of actual Native people. When Daniel and Ivy organized around the Indians of California case, they did so as Wiyats, with the full recognition that Wiyats were excluded from the original round of treaties. This work required both a sense of internal social coherence and external political recognition of who they were tribally, and thus the very specific nature of their organizing. In this moment, their activism illustrated both a blurring together in the sense of a newly emergent legal political identity of the Indians of California, and a moment that also demanded a tribal differentiation. Daniel and Ivy were drawn to the Indians of California land claims case because of the grand possibilities. Oh gosh. In social change brought to. Oh gosh. This is Patrick Henry Smith. These are some of his cellos that he made out of redwood laurels. During this time, California Indians across the state developed effective collective political strategies rooted in the context of entrenched legal and cultural injustice. Historians William Bauer, oh, thank you so much. Oh gosh, oh, almost done here. Historians William Bauer and Dana Akins track how the emergence of a legal, political, and cultural California Indian identity, quote, brought California Indians from across the state and nation into contact with one another. As they mounted sustained challenges with two distinct forms of politics, Bauer and Atkins argued that California Indians actively created a statewide identity that built on local communities without subsuming them. As a result of dozens of Indian-run auxiliaries across the state, California Indians organized community events, fundraised and traveled in delegations to battle for their righteous cause in the nation's capital. In this process, they scheduled and held meetings with Wiyat community leaders to help reconfigure Wiyat identity in the 20th century through the lens of the land claims case. This is another photo. Unfortunately, Daniel and Ivy's confronted not only the financial and legal challenges of the land claims case in their activism, but also the corrupt moral and financial dealings of the white organizer of the group which they worked. The man's name was Reverend Frederick Collette, and he created the organization called the Indian Board of Cooperation. Ivy spent considerable time and effort petitioning the Bureau of Indian Affairs Commissioner John Collier to stop Collette's involvement in the land claims case, which he's seen as that guy. Daniel and Ivy's political work had yet another distinct dimension through which they were able to assert a Wiyat identity and rally other Native people, both Wiyat and Pan-Indian. And that was their case against Frederick Collette, which they argued to Collier and the VA and the federal government to take action. Beginning in the 1920s, Collette became the foremost outside figure in the land claims case. Whether he was sincerely interested in supporting Native communities during this time, or just saw a financial opportunity yet untapped, his engagement with Indigenous individuals and organizations indicates a clear desire to make money off those he purported to support. In 1937, Ivy was a Wiyat person prominent in the charge against Collette's collections, and one of 154 other litigants who submitted depositions against Collette's Depression-era financial schemes. These depositions recited the methods and false pretenses Collette used to borrow and solicit funds, especially from those who did not have money to spare. Meanwhile, Daniel attempted to sue Collette for the $1,000 he had donated to the corporation under the pretense he was helping move the land claims case along. Collette was eventually dropped from the Methodist congressional rolls and turned from a church-going friend of the Indian to alleged embezzler and racketeer, a man who offered legal and political support to Native organizing while taking most but not all of the money he helped raise to line his own pockets. I have an article to be coming out against this called In the Grand Scheme of Things. It'll be in the Journal of California History. But in the 1910s and 20s, free land bases were purchased in the homelands. This is Frederick Collette. And are federally recognized tribal nations today. Here's the California Indian Herald, a quarterly newspaper that was created. This was a donation receipt. This is Jerry James, leader of the Wiyat tribe, who was also active against Collette's schemes. He wrote an op-ed that appeared in the Shasta newspaper talking about Collette's coming to Table Bluff and soliciting funds. So as Ivy organized dances at this time, like in Lolita and Eureka, to bring Native people all together and also fundraise to send delegations to Washington, D.C. So today there are three federally recognized tribes have Wiyot people in them, including the Wiyot tribe of the Table Bluff Reservation, the Blue Lake Rancheria, and the Bear River Band of the Ronaville Rancheria. These land bases were purchased due to the activism of Native Californians and the advocacy of C. Kelsey of the organization called the Northern California Indian Association, who lobbied the federal government. And during this time, the social and economic conditions of indigenous peoples in California changed. Taken together, the lives of Nancy, Matilda, and their descendants constitute part of a visible and material Wiyot community, telling stories about change and continuity before and after the massacre. In the 20th century, the descendants adopted new techniques and tools to rebuild community while sustaining and revitalizing cultural values. Three of Nancy's children lived past the age of 90, including the eldest child, William Sykes, who lived to be 100, Henry Spear, age 98, and the youngest child, Flora Anderson, who lived to be 90 years old. She died in 1969. But the lives of these descendants bridge an important gap in the history of Native California. The life, Nancy and Matilda's story of survival remained part of their children's lives and a thread between generations of Wiyots, even when their educations, professions, and interests took them in divergent directions. The stories and oral histories, cultural practices inspired by Nancy and Matilda and as survivors in the massacre generated meaningful cultural memories for the descendants in the Wiyot tribe more broadly. Their legacy of survival illuminates the intergenerational work of fostering resilience and asserting affirmations of Indigenous futures in the historic homeland of the Wiyot people on the north coast of California. Wiyot people's lands and waters were violently restructured by genocide, yet Wiyot people survived, endured, and developed strategies that they too remade and reshaped California. Today, there are hundreds of descendants of Nancy and Matilda. Some are enrolled in leaders of the Wiyot tribe, the Blue Lake Rancheria, and the Bear River Rancheria. As in reflection of this thriving future, a generation of younger redwoods now surrounds freshwater where once land had been clear cut, and the remnants of railroading and Milltown days are encircled by green meadows, flourishing home gardens, and grazing animals. The land has survived and recovered, as has the tribal nations that call this land home. By centering Native peoples and incorporating sources not just produced about them, but by them, the cacophony of violence gives space to Native voices, foregrounding their experience of surviving and continuing into the future beyond genocide. So they raised children here, they purchased land here, and they cultivated resources to build back community on the so-called lost coast. Some of Nancy and Matilda's descendants reshaped their lives and practices within external constraints of the agricultural economy by bossing intertribal timber crews, characterized by care for each other and the land. Some attended Indian boarding schools and became business entrepreneurs and successful musicians. Some left the area to find work or new adventures, and others continued to find purpose in California intertribal organizing efforts on behalf of the Indians of California Land Claims case. Importantly, these descendants stayed in community with one another and told their stories in the context of survival of Nancy and Matilda. Native California leaders and community members have embraced the hard reality of attempted genocide without rejecting any sense that it was successful, a sentiment that reverberates through the collective multimedia project of which this article is an outgrowth. Steered by myself, film director Michelle Hernandez, Wiyot and the Wiyot tribe, and editor Richie Wensler, Chula Reclaimed is a digital project that provides a critical snapshot of how the massacre is currently remembered on the land and showcases the linkages and legacy between this defining historical episode and the contemporary work of the Wiyot tribe. As a Native Studies scholar, Kocha Rosalie Baldi reflected in the film, quote, that kind of strength in the midst of atrocity and violence speaks to the fact that Wiyot peoples understood how cultural ceremonies connect with place to bridge historical memory for future generations. Highlighting important historical legacies within the intersections of Wiyot memory and lands and living Indigenous epistemologies, Chula Reclaimed offers a bite-sized multimedia reflection that readers of this article can discover alongside this HR special edition. As a result, almost all land of Chula is held in trust by the Wiyot tribe today. Currently, the village of Chula is listed on the National Register of Historical Places. It was added in 1966, and as a threatened historical or national historical landmark. The Wiyot tribe has worked diligently to clean up the extensive environmental contamination and decay and control erosion in collaboration with local, state, and federal agencies, including the Environmental Protection Agency. In 2017, the EPA gave the tribe the Excellence in Site Reuse Award, and this was the first time a tribe anywhere in the United States received such recognition. In conclusion, when we place Native voices at the center of the story, we recognize that the coast was never actually lost at all. The town known as Eureka, meaning I have found it, yields to the Wiyot place name Jarajuji, meaning where you sit and rest. The native call, we are still here, resonates strongly throughout this community of cultural revitalizers and political activists. On August 24th, 2024, just a month, a little bit ago, for example, Marnie Atkins, Wiyot Tribe Secretary, and Diane Warren, Wiyot Descent, organized a reunion for all of the descendants of Matilda and Nancy. The reunion coincided with Wiyot Day on the Wiyot Table Bluff Reservation to celebrate Wiyot history, culture, identity, and heritage. In this way, Wiyot people stayed together in community. And this is how they revived after things fell apart. Thank you so much.
All right, yeah, thank you, Dr. Whiteley, for that really amazing talk. And now we'll transition into question and answer. And to begin with, I was just curious about that term, the lost coast. And you mentioned it just there, and how the coast was not actually lost. Do you know where that term comes from? Not really. Okay. Yeah, I was just curious. So yeah. But yeah, we have another question. If there are any questions from the room, I want to make space for that as well. Are there any questions right off the bat?
Oh, I have lots of questions, but go ahead, start with those.
Okay. Well, I have one question from the viewers online. So Dr. Suzanne, is this Sparley? From the Pathways of Purpose nonprofit in Eureka, comments, the proposed large wind energy project and connected green port is that's being planned directly across the waterway from Tuluwat. The deep dredging and windmills may impact the sacred island there. And the question posed to Dr. Whiteley are your thoughts on the project, how this may relate to the history of colonialism and extraction, and how might resilience be leveraged to support the protection of sacred sites? Yeah, you have. Yeah. Do you want to?
Thank you. That is a great question. So I am living in Davis here. My parents both live in Eureka, as well as my grandma. I think the Wiyot tribe, as well as other tribal leaders, have had very specific things they said about the project. And I think following what they are advocating, which may be against this project, is the most important. And those voices should be, as the original people, should be taken to heart. I think there's a lot of different projects that can happen, especially in small towns. I'm born and raised in Eureka, but that's a really great question. But I would lead to whatever the Wiyot tribe or other tribal nations are saying about it. So it's a great question.
Yeah, you have a question.
Well, mine just has a lot to do with the family tree. I mean, is there a family tree of like all the different descendants of the Wiyot tribe that I could find online?
Yeah. So the genealogy that Olive Dean Davis completed in the 1920s had been updated until the 1970s, as well as a version in the 2000s that was did with some of the descendants born, after like the 1970s. So your name might be on that as a Wiyot descendant. And a lot of ancestry databases today have made it possible so people can find different relatives. So, for example, I do know that Paul Thompson, who is a descendant of Nancy or Matilda Spear, has an excellent wiki tree that he made that includes all of Nancy and Matilda's descendants, including grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren, includes things like what their professions were, schools they went to, photographs of them. That's free. That if you want, or you're more interested to look at, or if you'd like to go look at. Through the land claims cases, there are different Indians of California census rolls, which can have, or I guess you can't see it, but you can look online. They're all online. So the 1933 roll is on there, and most Spear descendants are on there. So like Flora Spear is on there. There'll be 4 different roles that happen through the land claims cases. So you can usually find a parent, grandparent, great grandparent that was on it that way, which is not the same as tribal enrollment, but is one resource to look for if you're interested in finding more about that genealogy. But you know, Native people are documented, and they have a lot of relatives, and so especially if you're descendant of a spear, you know, with so many kids, that you can really find your relatives in a variety of places, whether that's in Eureka, California, or it's across the US on the East Coast. So it's a really exciting time. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
All right, well, a related question to that one as well, talking about genealogy. This comes from Ryan Bass. And are you aware of any details regarding the family backgrounds of Matilda and Nancy Spear prior to their marriages to Spear, Sykes, and Hitchcock? Davis lists Matilda's maiden name as James within her history of the Spear family. I'm curious if there is any info above it. Also, could you elaborate on the Spear family members who attended the Hoopa boarding school?
Thank you so much. So Nancy's maiden name is sometimes written as Roberts or Shakespeare, and Matilda's is sometimes is listed as James. So she is related to the James family. So Nancy's father would be Shashape, who was a Riat medicine man, and his brother was Kiwilata, who was the chief of the tribe. So that would have been Matilda's mother or father. Matilda was a James, and if you're James, then we are related somewhere there, which there's a lot of, just awesome. If I missed the question.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So this one comes from Liza Grandia. And from your experience of working in the archives, what advice do you have for emerging scholars who want to pursue this work? Or maybe if you could talk about your process in the archives as well.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the question, Liza. There's so much history of Native California that is still in the primary resources. That kind of, as well as needs to be found. Maybe they're in someone's attic, and kind of take these, making your own archive, which is can take more time. But I think finding the sources and perspectives of Native people means kind of having to dig a little deeper. But it's such a rewarding and better history to tell. So for example, for my book project with the land claims cases, it's taken me to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives, where you have a lot of Native people going to testify on behalf of the land claims cases, as well as to Brigham Young University. The lawyers on behalf of the Indians of California second case created a law firm there, the Wilkinson, is his name, Ernest Wilkinson. And all of their papers are there, and they kept everything that was sent to them, including a lot of different journals, like Smoke Signals, which was a Native ran newspaper created by Marie Mason Potts. It was primarily to talk about the land claims cases through a group called the Federated Indians of California. There'd be many different types of intertribal activism that's always happening. California Indians have always organized. So you have, like, in the 1920s, you have the Indians of California, and then the 1930s, you have some different groups that come about. And then the 1940s, with the passage of the Indian Claims Commission Act, you have like I think 17 different groups that are created. In 1972, when the case finally pays out, you're going to have over 72 attorneys that'll be part of this case, and just different groups and tribal nations that are filing independent suits that be kind of pushed together to be part of the Indians of California. But those archives, it's really exciting to go and to look and see those. All the congressional hearings that happened in California since like 1920 are all online. They're 500, 600 pages long, and you can go in and see through the table of contents, you know, if you're looking for a specific person or your ancestor that may have testified at these hearings, which is always really powerful to see. And As well as a lot of papers are online today from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. John Collier was Commissioner of Indian Affairs from the 1930s to 1940s. All of his papers are online, and he was very involved in the Indians of California case. Him and Collette, the financial scammer I mentioned, they went back and forth for a couple years there, which is all in the archive, that archive. But yeah, I think as someone that is interested, does Native history, I think doing archival research is really fun and the best place to be. And for example, yesterday I got to do research here at the Bancroft Library because the case of the Indians of California in 1953 takes place right here at UC Berkeley, and it took place in the law school. So you had Native peoples coming to testify, as well as ethnohistorical research used to show or disprove land tenure. So you had both sides, the Indians California side and the federal government, using different sciences of the day to show or disprove the Indians occupied the land. And kind of outrageously, Beals, who is the federal government's anthropologist, lead anthropologist, maintained that California Indians only used 25% of the land, and which has real world implications for today when California Indians would only be paid out 47 cents per acre for the value of this land. And that was the final settlement. So I think moving forward, when we think about what's happening today, particularly with land back and like what the Wiyot tribe was able to do in Eureka, California, make international headlines, is just so impactful and so important. And I think in the future, moving forward into the future, there's going to be so much more push towards land back or recognizing the histories of this land, particularly places that where California tribal nations are not recognized, which is very hard to become readily recognized if you don't have land. So many different questions to answer. So, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious as a follow-up on that question as well. Just like, do you see your work with the archives in history and with the Wiyot tribes? Do you see that as an individual project or a collaborative project, or points of intersection where there's collaboration, and how those things interplay, and if that has impacts on your work?
Thank you so much. Gosh, it's a hot day. It's supposed to be 95 in Berkeley today, which is
Crazy.
oh, yeah, I think it's a really exciting time to do California studies because the research has really turned in the last couple of decades for working with by and for tribes. And there's groups like California Indian Studies and Scholars Association that has meetings quarterly. There's a conference to kind of get together and talk about different perspectives. I've been to a couple of the meetings, and I don't know if Peter's currently a member or not, but it's story as old as time in California Intertribal Organizing. So, it's very exciting to meet and talk to people who are doing similar work to you, especially you can come from so many different walks of life and ways of thinking about the world, but you can all come together to wanting to fight for injustices that happened here. And my work is particularly in history, and I don't really go past the 1970s, but through that we have I have different documents that I've kind of digitized that I've shared, like the California Indian Brotherhood correspondence at UC Riverside is a big one. The different depositions by Native Californians in front of the John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, digitized all of those. So sharing of the resources. I think California Indian Studies right now is kind of a booming field. There's so much research going on, and that's really exciting. And because sometimes when you do Native history, you can kind of go through a whole book and it doesn't even talk about California. So, or if something happened in California, it was different then, or it was unique history. But I think we can learn so much more from California history. And scholars have been doing this work for a long time. So Alfred Hurtado in 1990, like looking instead of the destruction of California Indians, as kind of declension narrative of Indians, tailing off the end to like, let's look at the survival of California Indians. And in history, William Bauer's work, he has a book with Damon Akins called We Are the Land. That is a wonderful book of all of Native California history in like 300 pages. I assign it for my classes that I teach. Has these wonderful vignettes of different place-based histories, like in Ukiah or San Francisco or Los Angeles, as well as tracing the different, different histories of different time periods from the 18th century to the present. So that's a great resource too. Yeah, thank you for the question, Peter.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, it's all really great work. So Chris Klein Hernandez asks, do you think your studies of Wiyot resilience inform our understandings of sovereignty in indigenous ecologies?
Oh, thanks for the question, Chris. Yeah, I think studies of resilience or survivance are very important, and when always wanting to tribal sovereignty, it's centering the tribe and what the tribal nation wants, desires, is doing. Also working in collaboration with them. So sharing your article, doing the film project, which is a collaborative project, doing these interviews with different people in the film. Yeah, I think moving forward, I think Native Studies is a really exciting field, and there's so much new work that's coming out and has been coming out for decades also. But that's a really great question.
And we have a question here from Professor Leanne Hinton. So she wants to thank you for the great talk that you gave, as well as ask if we would like to read the Wiyot testimonies, can they be found online?
Oh, great question. Yes, they are online. I have a link in one of my slides, but if you Google Wiyot history papers, they have been digitized by Cal Poly Humboldt. It's important to mention these papers were found by a local historian named Jerry Rohde, who has worked for decades in Humboldt County. It's his home. And he was able to find these papers. And the story of these papers deserves another article, which I hope Jerry also writes himself, but how he was able to get these papers back. So the testimonies were taken in the 1920s by Warren Brainerd, given to his sister, and then through different reasons and means, they weren't given back until 2010, when Jerry was able to get them from the descendant of a non-native person who had the papers. One of the stories of the papers, which is so important that these papers were given back, but is that one of the pages that includes from Native women who identified the perpetrators of the massacre on Tuluwat. The anonymous person that gave the papers back refused to give that page back. She said that they had descendants in the area, so I don't know if that means it, maybe she is, but I think it's important to know, we're not responsible for what our ancestors did, but we are responsible for what we do today. And giving back that page would be really important to think of, like, what can we do if these people kind of escaped from any type of justice. One of the perpetrators of massacre that Jerry Rohde has identified was a young man who did actually end up killing himself after. So there's that did happen. Just yeah. So, but I think yeah, the collecting of these documents is, and moving forward, if not keeping these things, of giving them to different to tribal nations, if that's what the papers are from, or if they're local histories and maybe talk about Native peoples, or because you can just find Native peoples mentioned in so many different parts of it. So in the Olive Davis handwritten family history, she talks about a woman named Topsy Rollins, who was a Wiyot medicine woman who would come by and doctor and heal the children with Wiyot ways of knowing medicine, and just like one little line like that, and you can just like dive in to figure out what else is happening, who is this, the different connections that are being made at this time, especially in Eureka. It's so funny being from Eureka as like a small town, biggest city in Humboldt County, but I always wanted to leave, and so I got to go to UC Berkeley here as an undergrad. But coming out of my high school, which was Academy of the Redwoods in Eureka, I got to take Introduction to Native American Studies, taught by a Tolowa professor named Joseph Giovanetti. And in that class, I met Michelle Hernandez, who is daughter of Ted Hernandez and the director of the film project we got to do, 10 years later. But in that film, when we were 17, or in that class when we were 17 at College of the Redwoods, we made this little film about the return of land to the Wiyot tribe, when in the early 2000s, Cheryl Seidner fundraised over $100,000 to buy back pieces of the land to Wiyot that would then be further returned in 2019. But kind of full circle, coming back to wanting to know more about Wiyot history, and growing up went to United Indian Health Service, and you walk around and you just see these beautiful canoes, and there's baby baskets on the wall, and paintings, and murals, and it's just such a rich history and so beautiful. So it's funny, with doing Native history in California, everybody goes to Humboldt and everyone's doing different things there. So some different pieces that I have coming out, it's always funny that you find that the person that's giving this speech that makes national news was in Eureka in 1939, or these Pan-Indian organizers like Zikal Saw came to Eureka High School to speak in 1920, and pulling out these histories is really exciting and kind of broadens our understanding of Native history. So yeah, everything else comes back to Humboldt, I guess, but I'm so happy to be here today and present here at UC Berkeley. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. So here's a question from David Perez, commenting on, I'm not sure about this name, M. Witchen, who investigates, sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, investigates white settlers co-opting indigeneity through marriage into Native communities in order to plunder Native resources. He says that you presented on a marriage as part of your work. In what ways did you find your work relating to this theme of co-opting indigeneity, particularly relating to the political economy of plunder?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a lot of different works today coming out about these mixed race children and maybe opportunities they had or did not have at the time. So Nancy and Matilda's husbands or fathers of their children were white men, and what choices they had at that time, I think, were very little. And but what I found most powerful about that is how the children wanted to understand more about their culture. They learned from their mothers, and older children could speak the language conversationally, the younger children could not. But yeah, he so for Arnold Spears' part in Freshwater is very American cultural imprint. He homesteaded his 160 acres. He cut down all the redwoods. He had a farm and was part of the settler economy. So but he did do some things like adopting the children with Nancy's X mark on the document, which she had 6 children before from different relationships, and all when he died, he left his land equally to of the 12 surviving at that point men and women with children, some which held on to that land. So Freshwater today, there's still descendants of Spears that have their land out there, and which is very powerful. Some sold the land. So my great-great-grandma was named Flora Spear. She was 4 years old when her mom died, so she didn't really, I don't know, she had different options. But what is really powerful is out there in Freshwater on that land is the cemetery. So so Nancy and Matilda and all of their descendants, every single child is buried there. So, and including grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. Today it's a private cemetery that's accessible from the road. You can go visit. In August, when they had the family reunion organized by Marnie Atkins and Diane Warren, that was one of the meeting spots to go out to, was to visit the cemetery, which was very impactful. We also took a tour on the Maniket, which is a boat, a very beautiful boat. So we got to go out as all descendants of Nancy Matilda Spear onto Humboldt Bay and actually go by the island itself and see Tululat. Today you can, it looks a little different than it would back then for many different reasons, but also the highway that was constructed in the 1970s that goes into Samoa kind of cuts that. But if you just you look at the land and how much work the Wiyot tribe has put into not only getting the land back, but the tremendous amount of stewardship they had to do to get this land back to being healthy. They had lines of just like batteries that were made into different walls, just polluting the land and waters. But yeah, Michael Wicken's work, Political Economy of Plunder. I use plunder in my own work. This idea of like thinking of native wealth, stealing of native wealth, broadly speaking. So you have lots of different kind of trends in Native histories of looking at this. Michael Wicken's work, the one the Pulitzer Prize, Claudia Wassant's work about Cherokee Nation and the removal of Cherokee people and who profited from those things. Emily Connolly's work on fiduciary colonialism and theft of Native resources. But he also have important works about thinking about how Native people tried to take some of that Native wealth back. So one way through like the land claims cases or repurchasing land. So in 1877, you have a Wiyot man named Dandy Bill who would repurchase land in his homeland where he was born, which is kind of wild to think that he'd have to purchase land that was just, taken 20 years prior. Yeah, I think it's important to think about these things as well as race and mixed race children and they're being part of this political economy of plunder or not, or making choices to do so or to not is important. And it's a complicated story. So thank you for the question. Yeah.
Okay, so a couple of people had commented, it's always great to get crowdsourced information as well about that Lost Coast question. That it was just the section where there's no highway, no highway access to the coast. But of course, it was never lost to Wiyot people, as you mentioned. So I just wanted to ask if there are any more questions from the room. Maybe one more question. Yeah.
I know Lost Coast as a surfing term. Apparently, there's very challenging waves that come in there, and it's hard to access. So, when I was small, we camped at Williams Grove, which is it was a couple of the closest little town was Wiyot, spelled W-E-O-T-T, and being in that place made me an environmentalist for life. I've just found it so beautiful. But it's only in the last year that I've seen the indigenous spelling of the name and realized that. So how, any idea how that town got named?
Yeah, Jerry Rody has published a book called Humboldt County's Place Names, and I would encourage, I think it's online, it can go look in Wiyot. I mean, there might have been Wiyot people that were living there, but I don't know why they called it Wiyot. It's spelled W-E-O-T-T.
And it's it's south and inland from Eureka ways.
Yeah, that's a great question. You have to drive by it, I guess, if you're going up or down on the 101. So.
And one more.
Yeah.
So the homeland was essentially on the island, or?
No, very broad. I think it's 100 plus miles of Wiyot lands. So Tuluwat would be the center of the Wiyot world. And there was Tuluwat, there's different, an island with evidence pointing to the Wiyot people being there for thousands of years through shell mounds and other archaeological artifacts that were unfortunately taken from the island around the turn of the 20th century from UC Berkeley. So through Alfred Kroberg's work. Eureka, Arcata is called Houdini. When we did the film screening at Cal Poly Humboldt, there was someone in the audience that actually said that they sent a postcard from LA to Arcata with, instead of calling it Arcata, they called it Houdini, including the zip code, and it went through. And I thought that was just such a wonderful, wonderful story. You can drive through Eureka, and there's a beautiful cultural center. We have cultural center in Old Town Eureka, as it's called, and the tribe has just done a beautiful job of reimagining the space. And you can go in and you can buy jewelry or different pieces of art or T-shirts and learn more about other beautiful baskets and other pieces of culture. But yeah, it was a large area. But all this land, all Native California land, was used and occupied, regardless of what the Indian Claims Commission said. But all around you have tribes within Humboldt County. I believe the Humboldt County still has the highest percentage of American Indians in the state of California, and of those, the vast majority are California Indians, which once you leave that place, California Indians become a much smaller percentage of the American Indian population. But yeah, Arcata up until Trinidad, I believe, and then to the south. And to the south, you also have Bear River Rancheria, as well as some other different tribal nations going south, like Wairaki. And of course, the largest reservation is the Hupa Valley Reservation. Largest tribe for enrollment is the Yurok tribe. So it's a really exciting area of things happening up there, which is really inspiring. But that's wonderful. You meet people that sometimes know of Humboldt County only for one thing, pre-legalization of marijuana. But it's also a place of so much rich history and just beauty. like what a spiritual experience to see redwoods. You know, for many tribal nations up there, these are living beings, and once you see them, you can kind of like understand why that would be for sure. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, so I think we'll just have one last question, and then we can continue questions over snacks and things like that. So this last question from online was, will your work be available at the Wiyot Cultural Center in Eureka?
Oh, that's so nice. My article will be coming out in December. Very happy to print it out. If they would like to have it on display, that would be wonderful. I know the Wiyot tribe did put it on the Facebook page yesterday, which was so nice and thankful. I hope that there are Wiyot people here, if I was descendant of a spirit or not. Yes, that would be great. I also have a piece I'm working on about like 1920s and 1930s about the land claims cases. Another piece out for review about the Indian Claims Commission that happens here at UC Berkeley and some of the testimony and activism against the settlement by the Pitt River Nation. And my book project that's looking at both of the cases. Yeah, I hope so. It'll be great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Whiteley, and yeah, let's give Dr. Whiteley one more round of applause, and we'll conclude there. Thank you.